Nobody told you that the most expensive weapon in the world isn't a missile. It's a choke point. And on February 28, 2026, one country used it. Let's talk about that. Picture a stretch of water 21 miles wide at its narrowest point. 21 miles. I've driven through worse traffic getting out of a stadium parking lot. And yet, 20% of the world's oil moves through that gap. 1/5 of the planet's energy supply squeezed through a maritime corridor about the width of a mid-sized American city. And for decades, the whole global economy just accepted that, priced it in, moved on. Because surely nobody would ever actually close it. Surely. Here's what makes this story different from every other war story. This isn't really about bombs. It's about a 40-year investment in leverage, and the moment someone finally cashed it in. Let's go back to the beginning, not February 2026, way before that. Iran, 1979, the Islamic Revolution, new government, new ideology, new foreign policy, and a very specific strategic problem. Iran is surrounded by rivals, Saudi Arabia to the west, Israel to the northwest, the United States, everywhere. And Iran's conventional military, post-revolution, post-sanctions, post-isolation, is not going to outgun those people in a straight fight. So what do you do when you can't win the game being played? You change the game. The solution they came up with was elegant in a deeply unsettling way. You don't build an army, you build an ecosystem. You fund, arm, train, and ideologically wire a network of proxy forces across the entire region. Lebanon, Iraq, Yemen, Gaza, Syria. And you connect them all through the IRGC's Quds Force, basically a special operations directorate whose entire job is managing this network. Call it vertical integration for asymmetric warfare. You're not paying for tanks, you're paying for influence. Distributed, deniable, expensive to destroy because it doesn't exist in one place. By 2024, this network, the so-called axis of resistance, had become genuinely formidable. Hezbollah alone, at its peak, was estimated to hold between 120,000 and 200,000 rockets and ballistic missiles. That is not a militia. That is the most heavily armed non-state actor in recorded history. And Iran had been funding it for decades at a reported rate of hundreds of millions of dollars annually, with U.S. officials estimating $700 million per year flowing to Hezbollah alone as of 2018. This was Iran's pension fund, its insurance policy, its deterrence architecture. Decades of patient, disciplined investment in the idea that any enemy attacking Iran directly would immediately find itself fighting on 6 fronts simultaneously. The plan was never to win a war. The plan was to make the cost of starting one unacceptable. And then, between October 2023 and December 2024, Israel systematically dismantled it. Hamas leadership, killed. Hezbollah's entire senior command, killed. The Assad regime in Syria, which hosted Iranian troops and controlled the land corridor from Iran to Lebanon, collapsed. The supply route, gone. The forward positions, gone. Years, decades of investment, erased in roughly 14 months. And then came June 2025, what analysts started calling the 12-day war. Israel hits Iranian nuclear and military targets directly. The United States joins with airstrikes on Iranian nuclear facilities. Iran launches a missile barrage targeting a hospital in Beersheba. Both sides back off. Ceasefire. But not really. Because now Iran is in a position nobody planned for. The insurance policy had been cashed out. The proxy architecture, the thing that was supposed to make attacking Iran suicidal, was wrecked. And the Iranian economy, already hammered by decades of sanctions, was deteriorating fast. By December 2025, mass demonstrations had erupted across the country, the largest protests since 1979. And in January 2026, the government massacred thousands of its own civilians trying to stop them. Trump, watching all of this, starts the largest U.S. military buildup in the region since the 2003 Iraq invasion. More than 50,000 troops, 200-plus fighter jets, 2 aircraft carriers. The stated goal, according to the Pentagon, eliminate Iran's ballistic missile capabilities. The missiles were described as a shield being used to protect the nuclear program. And then, negotiations began. Actual, direct negotiations between the U.S. and Iran, the first real talks since Trump pulled out of the JCPOA nuclear deal in 2018. There was, apparently, a path to a deal. On February 28, 2026, during those negotiations, the United States and Israel launched coordinated airstrikes on Iran. The strikes killed Supreme Leader Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, multiple other senior officials, targeted military installations, civilian casualties reported. The Trump administration later offered several different explanations for why they did it: forestalling a planned Iranian attack, preventing nuclear weapons, achieving regime change, seizing oil resources. The explanations changed depending on the day and the audience. What didn't change was the outcome. Bam! Strait of Hormuz closed. Iran launches hundreds of ballistic missiles and drones at Israel, at U.S. bases in Bahrain, Jordan, Kuwait, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, and the UAE. Civilian infrastructure struck in Oman. A drone hits Britain's Akrotiri base in Cyprus. Missiles intercepted over Turkey. And on day 2, Hezbollah resumes rocket attacks on Israel after 15 months of quiet. Iraqi militias launch 67 drone and missile attacks on U.S. bases in 48 hours. Iran's new supreme leader, Mojtaba Khamenei, the dead man's son, appointed within days, demands all U.S. military bases in the Middle East close immediately. Wait, the replacement for the man they killed to trigger regime change is the man's son, who is, ideologically, identical to his father. The regime change worked perfectly. Here's the financial part, and this is where it gets genuinely instructive. Brent crude oil, $73 a barrel on February 27, 2026. By March 8, 10 days later, $107, a 46% increase in 10 days. Around 20% of global LNG production goes offline. The Strait of Hormuz, through which 20% of the world's oil normally flows, is closed. Supply chains for food, chemical fertilizers, industrial goods, all of them run through that corridor. One analyst, writing in March 2026, said a prolonged closure could produce consequences more severe than COVID-19 for global food markets. That's not a reckless comparison. COVID disrupted supply chains for months. A closed Strait of Hormuz disrupts energy supply for every country on Earth that buys Middle Eastern oil, which is most of them. And here's the genuinely maddening part. You know who benefits from all of this? Russia. Russia, which had received thousands of Iranian Shahed drones and short-range ballistic missiles for use in Ukraine. Russia, which had helped Iran set up a massive drone factory inside Russian territory. Russia, which in return for all of that, provided Iran, in its hour of need, with satellite imagery showing the locations of U.S. warships and aircraft. Deniable. Asymmetric. Pentagon officials noted that several Iranian strikes hit facilities directly associated with U.S. operations, targets whose coordinates don't appear on any public map. When asked about it, Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth said Russia and China were not really a factor. Meanwhile, U.S. officials were telling the Washington Post that Moscow was feeding Iran real-time targeting data from its satellite constellation, including a satellite, the Qayyum, that Russia built for Iran, launched in 2022, providing 1.2-meter resolution imagery of U.S. and Israeli bases. One of the sources told CNN that a drone which killed 6 U.S. service members in Kuwait hit a location that doesn't appear on any public map. The drone found it anyway. Russia publicly denied all of it. Russia did not stop doing it. Now, here's the thing about China. Because China's position in this story is maybe the most coldly rational calculation of the entire conflict, and almost nobody is talking about it correctly. China buys 87.2% of Iran's annual crude oil exports. 87.2%. Iran supplies China with oil at discounts as steep as $14 per barrel below market, saving Beijing roughly $7 billion a year. Iran is also a critical node in China's Belt and Road Initiative, a land corridor alternative to sea lanes that China doesn't fully control. And in the years before this war, China had quietly been integrating Iran into its military technological ecosystem, transitioning Iranian navigation from US GPS to China's encrypted Beidou-3 satellite network, supplying Iran with the YLC-8B anti-stealth radar, a system specifically designed to reduce the effectiveness of radar-absorbent coatings on U.S. stealth aircraft like the B-21 Raider and the F-35C, providing missile spare parts and dual-use components through a web of intermediaries. China never fired a shot. China's hardware was already there. When the war started, China condemned the strikes, requested emergency UN Security Council meetings alongside Russia, and did not deploy military forces. It sent envoys. It warned of flames spreading. It evacuated its nationals, and, according to reporting, it quietly convinced Iran to accept a Pakistan-brokered ceasefire proposal. China positioned itself as the adult in the room, the peacemaker, the neutral party. And here's the thing. Every day the United States is militarily consumed in the Middle East is a day China's strategists describe as a valuable time out to build military capability around the Taiwan Strait. The Strait of Hormuz crisis moves U.S. aircraft carriers and THAAD missile defense systems from the Pacific to the Gulf. The U.S. pivot to Asia evaporates, and China doesn't have to do anything except wait. Both Russia and China are running the same play. Transform Iran into a Ukraine for the United States. Force Washington to burn through interceptor missiles, ammunition stockpiles, and political capital. Not by fighting, by enabling, by supplying, by being Iran's eyes and logistics without ever being Iran's sword. Iran invested 40 years building a network to make attacking it too expensive. Russia and China are now investing nothing to make the aftermath of attacking it equally expensive. Different strategy. Same math. Now, everybody's supposed to be on the same side. Russia, China, Iran, this so-called crink axis. North Korea in there too, allegedly. And yet, when Iran needed the most, here's what actually happened. The Carnegie Endowment put it flatly. In Iran's hour of greatest need, neither Russia nor China came to its aid in a forceful, kinetic, and undeniable way. Russia shared satellite pictures. China shipped missile spare parts. Neither sent a soldier. Neither deployed a warship. Iran, which had provided Russia with thousands of drones and helped build a drone factory on Russian soil, presumably believing that one day Moscow would return the favor, discovered that geopolitical partnerships come with fine print. The fine print, it turns out, reads, "We'll help you enough to keep you useful, but not enough to make your problem our problem." Alliances built on shared resentment of a common enemy are not the same as alliances built on mutual obligation. Turns out there is a difference. And what about the axis of resistance, the 40-year investment? Here's the balance sheet as of April 2026. Hezbollah, re-engaged, but an NBC analysis described them as significantly weakened. Lebanon's government banned their military activities, Lebanese army redeploying to border regions. Estimates from Israeli Channel 12 put Hezbollah's remaining arsenal at approximately 25,000 missiles, down from a pre-2024 peak of up to 200,000. 75 to 87% liquidated. That's not an insurance policy anymore. That's the aftermath of a claim. Iraqi militias, Kataib Hezbollah, Asaib al-Haq, Harakat Hezbollah al-Nujaba, launched 67 drone and missile attacks in the first 48 hours. Kataib Hezbollah announced it would drag the U.S. into a long war of attrition. U.S. and Israeli strikes on their positions in Iraq killed 7 members of the Iraqi armed forces, not militias, in a friendly fire-adjacent situation that caused Baghdad to summon the U.S. embassy's charge d'affaires. Iraq is now caught between a government trying to stay neutral and militia forces it cannot fully control. The Houthis. The Houthis are a case study in cold strategic calculation. They have the most intact military capability of any Axis member at this point. They control most of northern and central Yemen. They sit on the Bab el-Mandeb Strait, the second most important maritime choke point in the world after Hormuz. They could, in theory, simultaneously close both choke points and remove 2 of the world's top 3 oil corridors from global commerce at once. And they waited. For a month, they held protests, issued statements, made threats, didn't shoot. Why? Because the U.S. sent warnings through Omani mediators, because their weapons stockpile was still depleted from the 2023 to 2025 campaign, because Houthi leaders were told their phones were under surveillance, because they watched what happened to Hezbollah's leadership and decided that discretion, for now, was the better part of ideology. On March 28th, they finally launched ballistic missiles at Israel coordinated with Hezbollah and Iran. Slow, measured, calibrated to send a signal without triggering total annihilation. By April 7, 2026, China and Russia vetoed a UN Security Council resolution on Hormuz shipping escorts. China reportedly helped broker a fragile 2-week ceasefire. Pakistan provided the diplomatic channel. And somewhere in a Washington Situation Room, someone is doing the math on how long the U.S. can sustain 50,000 troops, 2 carrier groups, and 200 fighter jets in an active conflict, while simultaneously managing Taiwan, Ukraine, and a domestic economy absorbing a 46% oil price spike. That math is the real war. Here's the ironic part. And this is the part that would be funny if it wasn't so expensive. The U.S. spent decades helping Iran build the geopolitical conditions for exactly this outcome. The 2003 Iraq invasion removed Saddam Hussein, the one regional power actively containing Iran's influence. The resulting power vacuum allowed Iran to extend its reach into Iraq, link up with Syria, and build the Shia corridor that became the backbone of the axis of resistance. Then, when that axis became threatening enough, the response was to dismantle it, which left Iran with no buffer, no deterrence, and no option except to use the one leverage point nobody had taken away, the Strait of Hormuz. The very strategy of maximum pressure that was supposed to contain Iran stripped away every reason Iran had to not use its ultimate card. The plan was to make the cost of attacking Iran's nuclear program low enough to be worth it. It did not account for the cost of winning. And as always in these situations, the bill doesn't come to the people who made the decision. It comes to everyone else. Brent crude at $107, LNG offline, global supply chains reshuffling, Russia's budget windfall estimated between $45 billion and $97 billion from the oil price surge alone, China's Taiwan window quietly widening, Iran's new supreme leader, the dead man's son, demanding U.S. bases close as a precondition for peace, the Houthis, finger on the trigger, Hezbollah rebuilding, Iraqi militias threatening attrition. One last thing. Before this conflict, Iran was selling oil to China at $14 below market rate, saving Beijing $7 billion a year. In return, China supplied radar systems and electronic warfare equipment that made U.S. stealth aircraft less stealthy. The U.S. aircraft carrier USS Abraham Lincoln and USS Gerald Ford were operating within engagement range of Chinese-supplied CM-302 supersonic anti-ship missiles. the export version of a weapon military analysts call a carrier killer, capable of Mach 3 sea skimming, compressing a ship's reaction window to seconds. China never needed to fire those missiles. They were already in Iranian hands, paid for in oil discounts. The most expensive weapon in the world isn't a missile, it's a choke point. And the second most expensive weapon isn't a carrier killer, it's a discount. 40 years. That's how long this investment took to mature. 40 years of proxy networks, of arms transfers, of satellite deals, of below-market oil, of patient strategic positioning. By Iran, by Russia, by China, by everyone involved. And at Money Never Learns, we keep watching the same pattern. The bill for short-term decisions always arrives. Always. Just usually for someone who didn't sign the check. 21 miles wide, 1/5 of the world's energy, and everyone assumed it would never actually be used as a weapon. They assumed wrong. They always do. They always do. You think this pattern is finished? The ceasefire is 2 weeks old and already fragile. The Houthis are still on the trigger, Russia's satellites are still watching, China's radars are already installed. And somewhere, someone is making the same calculation the Iranians made in 1979. Not how to win the next war, but how to make starting it unthinkable. If you'd rather understand the economics of how these things unfold before they unfold, you know where the button is. Most people won't click it. Most people didn't think the Strait of Hormuz would actually close either.